Good evening, boils and ghouls. 'Tis me, 'tis I, your old pal, the Collector. And a few weeks ago, I made a post on my Instagram profile, @OldPalCollector, for you to all choose a number between 1 and 4. And I'd randomly select someone's answer and read the chapter from Tales from the Crypt Volume 3, published in 1991 by Random House, that corresponded with that number. Thanks to everyone who played along, and the person who was chosen at random was @Valnora. Go and check out her Instagram account, a horror fan at heart, and I'll admit, has a collection of spooky goodness that makes your old pal a little jealous. And the Fable Fright that @Valnora has chosen for you all is Mournin Ambrose. Shall we begin? Standing on the shadowy front porch, Andrew DeMare lifted the rusty door knocker and rapped it against the heavy, forbidding door. A hollow boom echoed through the cavernous mansion, replaced by a moment later by the sound of shuffling feet. The door emitted a high, creaking squeal as it opened, and a wrinkled face peered through a 2-inch crack. "Are you my Uncle Ambrose Hawley?" Andrew asked, hoping it wasn't true. The old man's eyes lit up and a wide grin stretched across his shriveled face. Uncle Ambrose swung the door open and extended his arms as wide as his unsettling grin. "That's me!" he exclaimed with a pulsing excitement that would have seemed impossible from the old man just seconds before. "You must be Andrew, my nephew. Come in." A moment later, a leathery old woman shuffled into the foyer. Her grey hair was loosely pulled back into a bun. She was so hunched over, she would have fallen on her face had it not been for the cane she carried. "Who's that?" she cawed, her teeth rattling. "You remember Andrew, don't you?" Ambrose said calmly. "He's going to stay with us a while. Andrew, this is your Aunt Elsa." The old woman's face went white as a ghost. Her eyes grew wide with unmistakable terror. My sister Stella's boy? Has it come to that?" "Please, Elsa," Ambrose said quietly. He glanced at Andrew. "She hasn't been, well, lately." "They're all dead!" Aunt Elsa shrieked. "3 of them, out there in the mausoleum!" "Elsa," Ambrose commanded, "go to the library. We'll be there momentarily." "What's she talking about?" Andrew asked, confused. His uncle dismissed his wife's ranting with a wave of his hand. The old woman grunted angrily and shuffled out of the foyer, disappearing through a narrow doorway. "She's not, well, here," Uncle Ambrose announced, tapping the side of his head with a crooked finger. "Ever since the first death." "The first death," Andrew said, not sure he'd heard right. Uncle Ambrose seemed apologetic. "Of course, you couldn't have known. It happened 3 years ago, when we first moved here. One of your distant cousins came to stay with us. Lovely woman, she died in her sleep. I didn't hear about it. There were other deaths?" "2 others," Uncle Ambrose said. "My aged brother came to stay with us about 2 years ago. He passed away about a month later. Then my only niece came. It was tragic. Such a young girl." He shook his head sadly. "Elsa took the first 2 hard, but the last? Well, something just cracked." "You mean she's crazy?" "Shh," Uncle Ambrose hissed. "Not crazy, really. Just a little overdramatic. She tends to exaggerate." They strolled through the dusty foyer into the library. There were books from wall to wall, floor to ceiling. Sounds amazing. None of them looked as though they'd been dusted in 20 years. Definitely amazing. "This is a fantastic library," Andrew said. "I agree." Glancing around the room, he turned and was startled by Aunt Elsa's wrinkled face staring at him, not more than a foot away. "Like to read?" she said. "Of course," he gulped, taking a giant step backward. "I go to college. I'm studying to be a writer." Ever read Macbeth, where it says murder will out? She stared at him through tired eyes. No, Andrew stuttered. Elsa, please, Ambrose said, grabbing Andrew by the arm and leading him out to the hallway. Come with me, Andrew. I'll show you to your room. They climbed the wide marble stairs and walked the entire length of a dimly lit hallway. Ambrose stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. I'm sure you're tired after such a long journey. I hope you'll be comfortable here. Andrew smiled. I'm sure I will, he said, and bid his uncle good night. Andrew paced about the room, still a little shaken by the sight of his deranged old aunt staring at him and telling him to read Macbeth. He crouched before a gigantic fireplace, struck a match, and touched it to the wood piled on the andirons. As the fire began to crackle and glow brightly, Andrew heard a strange thumping sound coming from behind him. A chill ran down the back of his neck. He stared into the reddish-blue glow of the flames, afraid to look behind him. When he did, he almost fell into the blazing fire. Aunt Elsa was shuffling toward him, her cane thumping against the wooden floor. Andrew rose, his heart thumping 10 times faster than her cane. I've come to warn you, Andrew, she said, her voice quivering. Get out! Get out of this house and never come back! He's a fiend! A despicable fiend! Uncle Ambrose, yes! I mustn't let it happen again! It's too horrible to imagine! You must leave at once! He's... A shadow suddenly loomed across Aunt Elsa's face. Elsa, get to bed this minute, Uncle Ambrose roared. Yes, Ambrose, said Aunt Elsa. I'm going. She turned and looked into Andrew's eyes pleadingly. Remember, Andrew, murder will out! Andrew tossed and turned most of the night, more confused than ever. What was his aunt warning him about? The memory of her face, pallid and filled with fright, haunted him. And that phrase she had uttered so mysteriously. Murder will out. What did it mean? Loud, furious knocking woke him from what seemed like a very brief sleep. Andrew struggled to rouse himself. Bright morning sunlight poured in through the cracks in the heavy curtains, searing his eyes. Andrew! Andrew! Uncle Ambrose called frantically. Come quickly! It's Aunt Elsa! Andrew jumped out of bed. He swung open the door and came face to face with Uncle Ambrose. Tears were streaming down the old man's face, and his decrepit body trembled. Uncle Ambrose, what's happened? It's Elsa, his uncle sobbed. She's dead. Aunt Elsa's funeral, 2 days later, was a lonely, somber affair. An old priest from the town closest to the holy estate presided over the short ceremony. Afterward, her coffin was carried out to the family mausoleum. Andrew had hoped to leave the day after the funeral, but worried about Uncle Ambrose. The old man barely talked anymore. At dinner, his plate went untouched. Each night, Andrew watched sadly as his uncle descended the winding stone pathway that led from the back of the house to the mausoleum. Poor old guy, Andrew thought. He really misses her. After watching Uncle Ambrose take his evening walk to the mausoleum, Andrew wandered restlessly into the library. His eyes scanned the walls, looking at the endless titles that could barely be read through the thick dust covering them. The leather spine of one book, however, was as dust-free as if it had been printed yesterday. The title was Macbeth. Have you ever read Macbeth? Andrew could almost hear his aunt's quivering, pleading voice calling to him. Murder will out! He pulled down the book, opened it, and recognized his aunt's weak, scratchy handwriting. It was her diary. That's what she had been trying to tell him. She had wanted him to read her diary. The handwriting was sloppy, almost unintelligible, but gradually he was able to make out certain words. Ambrose. Suffocation. Murder. Soon he could read whole sentences, and what he read terrified him. Andrew slapped the book shut and shuddered. He had to talk to the police. Chief Inspector Spencer listened quietly as Andrew read aloud from his aunt's diary. The inspector's assistant, Detective Kelly, thoughtfully twisted his perfectly formed handlebar moustache in silence. And this one, Inspector. Listen to this. I know how he murdered them. Suffocation. He drugged them so they couldn't resist, then smothered them with a pillow. But why? Why? Inspector Spencer glanced at his assistant, but his stern face showed no emotion. Here's the last passage, Andrew went on. Andrew has arrived today. He will be next. I must warn him. The fiend will do to him what he has done to the others. If Ambrose were to find out that I mean to tell Andrew everything, he would certainly kill me. The inspector's bushy eyebrows arched grimly. And you say Ambrose interrupted Elsa that night as she was about to tell you something? Andrew nodded. Still, one thing puzzles me. If he murdered her, why does he mourn her? Murdered her, Detective Kelly scoffed. The doctor called it a natural death. Well, suffocation looks like a natural death, Andrew cried, rising angrily from his chair. The only way to prove that she was murdered, Mr. DeMere, is to get permission from your uncle to disinter the body and perform an autopsy, said the inspector. The next day, Andrew watched from high atop the staircase as the two police detectives spoke to Uncle Ambrose, telling him they wanted to disinter Aunt Elsa. Never, never, Uncle Ambrose cried. If you refuse, Mr. Hawley, we can get a court order giving us permission, Inspector Spencer replied. Please, you have no right to disturb her, Ambrose sobbed. She's been laid to rest. Leave her alone. The two detectives glanced at each other, then bid Ambrose good night. Andrew hurried down a back staircase and met them before they got into their car. Well, what are you going to do? He asked. Just stay calm, said Detective Kelly. Inspector Spencer placed his hat on his head. And keep your eye on him, DeMere. We'll be in touch. That night, when Uncle Ambrose put on his overcoat and walked out the door of the mansion, Andrew followed. He trailed his uncle's shadowy figure as it descended the sloping path, crossed the neglected garden, and entered the mausoleum. Andrew crept silently along the edge of the small stone building until he stood directly outside its partially open door. He listened a moment, but heard nothing. Shouldn't his uncle be crying or talking gently to his recently deceased wife, telling her that he missed her and would someday be with her? Andrew was wondering about all these things when he peered into the darkened tomb from behind a stone pillar. A moan almost escaped his throat. He placed a trembling hand over his mouth and stumbled as far away from the tomb as he could. He stopped at a tree, gagging violently. Then he heard footsteps beside him. DeMere, what's wrong? Detective Kelly asked, alarmed at the sight of Andrew's deathly pale face. He's sick as a dog, said Spencer. DeMere, where's your uncle? In the tomb, Andrew managed to say. Hurry! The two detectives burst through the door of the mausoleum. Uncle Ambrose was hunched over Aunt Elsa's coffin. When he saw them, the old man growled at the intruders. Get out, he snarled. Behind him was the partially eaten corpse of his wife. Chunks of her dead flesh had been ripped from her body. The demented old man's skeletal hands were reaching for more. He's a ghoul, Kelly cried in horror. He's a sick fiend, just like the old lady's diary said. Grab him, the inspector yelled, lunging at the ghastly old man. Several other police officers rushed into the tomb, shackled the wildly screaming man, and carted him away. What made you come back? Andrew asked the detective shakily. A hunch, said Spencer. We talked to the undertaker back in town. He told us that your uncle never let him embalm any of the bodies. That's when we knew something was wrong. The other bodies in the tomb had been stripped of their flesh, too. Andrew gagged. You okay, DeMere? Inspector Spencer asked. A little wobbly, Andrew admitted. He shuddered and shook his head. But at least, I'm not going to be a 7-course meal for that hideous old man. Well, isn't that special? It's good to see old Uncle Ambrose was at least keeping it in the family. I guess Ambrose's home-cooked meals aren't what they used to be. Aunt Elsa? Oh, forget it. Congratulations again to @Valnora for being the winner, and thanks to everyone who played Choose the Chapter. Don't forget to follow me at Old Pal Collector on Instagram for your next chance to have a little shout out. by yours truly. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and ring that little bell icon to be notified of my next visit into your nightmares. And now, thanks for watching, everyone, and until we shriek again, good night out there, whatever you are.